The Murdaughs were more than a family, they were a legacy. In the quiet southern town of Hampton, their name held a kind of power that shaped lives and silenced questions. For generations, the Murdaugh men had been the face of law and order, serving as prosecutors, judges, and attorneys. They attended every town event, donated to local schools, and helped rebuild churches after storms. People greeted them with respect, sometimes with fear. To outsiders, the family appeared to embody success and community pride. But beneath that charm lay a history no one dared to question. Their grand estate stood on the edge of town, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to swallow sound. The house was beautiful yet unsettling, its silence heavy, its hallways lined with portraits of ancestors who all shared the same piercing eyes. At night, the distant sounds of the swamp echoed through the property, and the flicker of lights in empty rooms made neighbors wonder who or what still lingered inside. Few people were ever invited past the gates. Those who were often said it felt less like visiting a home and more like stepping into another world, one ruled by power and secrets. Over the years, strange events had followed the Murdaughs. An employee had once vanished after claiming to know too much about the family's finances. A hunter disappeared on their land and was never found. Police reports were written, then quietly withdrawn. Locals whispered about these things in hushed tones at diners and barbershops, but never too loudly. The Murdaughs had connections in every corner of the law, and speaking against them could end careers, or worse. Yet, despite the unease, the family's influence continued to grow. Their wealth expanded through legal victories, real estate, and rumored backroom deals. No one challenged them because in Hampton the Murdaugh name was law. They lived as if untouchable, believing that no scandal could ever stain their reputation. But beneath the polished surface of charity events and courtroom victories, resentment was building. There were people who had lost everything to the Murdaughs, people who wanted justice, and others who wanted revenge. As the years passed, those hidden resentments turned into quiet plans. And in the summer of that fateful year, when the air was thick with heat and secrets, the cracks beneath the family's perfect image began to show. What had been buried for decades was about to rise to the surface, setting off a chain of events that would finally expose the deadly truth behind the Murdaugh legacy. The night of the tragedy was heavy with humidity, the kind of night when the air itself seemed to carry tension. At 10:25 p.m., the local sheriff's office received a trembling call from the Murdaugh estate. The voice on the other end was broken, panicked, and barely understandable. Within minutes, patrol cars were racing down the long stretch of Moselle Road, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness of the countryside. When officers arrived, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for years. Near the family's dog kennels, two bodies lay on the ground, lifeless, cold, and surrounded by the quiet hum of crickets. It was the young Murdaugh son and his mother. The ground was slick, and the air smelled of gunpowder and damp earth. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, and no footprints leading away from the scene. Whoever had done this had either vanished into thin air or was someone who had no need to break in. The responding officers had known the family for years, which made their silence heavier. The first theories were simple. Perhaps a robbery, maybe an act of revenge. But as detectives examined the evidence, those explanations quickly fell apart. Nothing valuable had been taken from the house. Jewelry, cash, even vehicles, all untouched. The victims' phones were still nearby. The brutality of the crime felt personal, deliberate, and emotional. As the investigation deepened, the town of Hampton began to tremble under the weight of speculation. News crews arrived, hovering like vultures around the edges of the Murdaugh property. Neighbors whispered that this was punishment, that someone had finally dared to cross the family's line. Others thought it was an inside job, an act committed not out of hate, but desperation. The town that had once worshipped the Murdaughs now found itself questioning everything it believed about them. Detectives worked day and night, trying to piece together the timeline of the evening. Security cameras revealed little. The family's sprawling property offered too many blind spots. But one detail stood out, a series of phone calls made in the hours before the murders. Calls that went unanswered. Calls that, if traced, might hold the key to the truth. By the end of the week, one thing was certain. The Murdaugh family was no longer untouchable. The tragedy had shattered the illusion of power that had protected them for generations. and the small southern town was about to learn just how deep the darkness surrounding the Murdaughs truly ran. In the weeks that followed the murders, the investigation into the Murdaugh family's past began to unravel a disturbing pattern that stretched back decades. What had initially appeared to be an isolated tragedy was soon revealed to be just one chapter in a much longer story of corruption, greed, and buried secrets. Detectives, driven by growing public pressure, began re-examining old files connected to the family, cases that had long been closed or quietly dismissed. What they found raised more questions than answers. Years earlier, a young housekeeper who had worked at the Murdaugh estate had died under mysterious circumstances. The story had been simple on paper, an accidental fall down the stairs. But as investigators reopened the file, inconsistencies appeared. Insurance policies had been altered shortly before her death, and large sums of money meant for her family had vanished. Witness statements had been edited, and the official reports bore the fingerprints of someone with influence. The deeper the police looked, the clearer it became that her death was anything but accidental. Another tragedy emerged, a boating accident involving the Murdaugh's youngest son. A young woman had lost her life, and though many suspected reckless behavior and intoxication, the case never reached trial. The family's lawyers had worked tirelessly to redirect blame, ensuring their son faced minimal consequences. It was yet another reminder of how justice seemed to bend around the Murdaugh name. But now, with fresh eyes and renewed determination, investigators began linking these past incidents to the current murders. Financial records revealed missing funds from the family's law firm, stretching back years. Millions had quietly disappeared, with forged documents and hidden accounts masking the theft. Even more unsettling were the whispers about those who had tried to expose the corruption: former employees, business partners, and witnesses who had either vanished or withdrawn their statements under suspicious circumstances. The image of the noble, law-abiding Murdaugh family was collapsing under the weight of evidence. Their influence, once a shield, now drew unwanted attention. Every headline, every news broadcast, and every rumor pushed the family further into isolation. It was no longer just about solving a double homicide. It was about uncovering the rot that had been festering beneath generations of wealth and privilege. And as the walls began to close in, those who had once protected the Murdaughs started to turn on them, fearing they might be the next to fall. As investigators dug deeper, the once powerful Murdaugh family began to crumble from the inside out. Their law firm, which had stood for nearly a century as a pillar of authority and respect, was now the center of a massive financial scandal. Auditors uncovered evidence of years of embezzlement, falsified settlements, and clients whose compensation had mysteriously disappeared. What had been hidden behind polished offices and expensive suits was now laid bare for the world to see. The empire that had given the Murdaughs their influence was collapsing under the weight of its own deceit. Public opinion turned swiftly and harshly. The family that had once been untouchable was now surrounded by flashing cameras and angry crowds demanding answers. The surviving members tried to maintain their innocence, but contradictions in their statements only deepened suspicion. Investigators traced missing funds to secret accounts, and the trail led directly back to one member of the family, the same person who had made the desperate 911 call the night of the murders. It soon became clear that the killings were not random, nor were they the work of an outsider. The truth, as the detectives pieced it together, was far more chilling. The murders had been orchestrated to gain sympathy, to distract from the growing financial crimes, and perhaps even to manipulate insurance payouts. The plan had spiraled out of control, leaving behind irreversible consequences. The person responsible had believed that controlling the story could save what was left of the family's name and wealth. Instead, it destroyed everything. Court documents once sealed became public. Old allies turned into witnesses. Former friends in law enforcement stepped forward, admitting to years of favors and overlooked evidence. The Murdaugh family's reach, once thought limitless, shrank overnight. Each revelation made the tragedy seem less like a moment of madness and more like the final act of a dynasty desperate to protect itself from collapse. By the time the trial began, the Murdaugh name had become synonymous with betrayal and greed. The town of Hampton watched as their former heroes were exposed for what they truly were: people who had used power not to serve justice, but to escape it. The empire built on influence and fear had finally fallen, and the truth that emerged was more devastating than anyone had imagined. The family's legacy was gone, replaced by a story of deceit, destruction, and a desperate attempt to hide the inevitable. In the years after the Murdaugh empire crumbled, the once bustling town of Hampton became a place marked by quiet unease. The family's grand estate, once filled with laughter, parties, and the hum of influence, now stood abandoned. The mansion's windows were boarded up, the gardens overgrown, and the driveway cracked from years of neglect. Locals said the air around the property felt heavy, as if the land itself remembered the blood that had been spilled there. The Murdaugh estate became a grim reminder of how power, greed, and deceit could destroy even the mightiest of families. The investigation didn't end with the trial. New detectives, free from the fear that once surrounded the Murdaugh name, reopened several old cases connected to the family. They examined every unexplained death, every suspicious financial transaction, and every person who had once mysteriously vanished after crossing paths with them. Files that had long been buried in courthouse archives began to reveal patterns, names repeated across decades, documents forged in the same handwriting, and evidence that had been deliberately hidden. What emerged was a timeline of corruption stretching back nearly a century. One of the most chilling discoveries came when ground-penetrating equipment was used on parts of the Moselle property. Investigators uncovered human remains buried deep beneath an old storage shed. The discovery reignited speculation that the Murdaugh estate had served as more than just a home. It had been a graveyard for secrets no one was meant to uncover. Forensic testing linked the remains to a former employee who had gone missing years before, someone rumored to have threatened to expose the family's financial crimes. The findings reignited public fascination. Documentaries, books, and podcasts dissected every detail of the family's fall from grace. Some saw it as justice long overdue, while others believed the full truth had still not been told. The surviving members of the Murdaugh bloodline disappeared from public life, leaving behind unanswered questions and rumors of hidden wealth that no investigator had ever found. Today, the story of the Murdaughs lives on in whispers. Those who drive past the old estate at night claim to see flickering lights in the windows and hear faint voices carried on the wind. Whether it's imagination or something else, no one can say for sure. What everyone agrees on, however, is that some secrets never stay buried, and the Murdaugh family's deadly legacy still haunts Hampton to this day.